time, we're going to go to South Asia and Southeast Asia, respectively. In particular, we're going to look at the Philippines and India, two countries that were already in the headlines even before COVID for going a sort of authoritarian trend. And now, of course, we're very curious to see what our speakers have to say, how the corona crisis, how the coronavirus has affected civil liberties in those two countries. It's my great pleasure to welcome the head of research and strategy of the news site Rappler, a very prominent news site, Gemma Mendoza. Also joining us, Gemma Mendoza is joining us from Manila. Joining us from New Delhi, India, is the executive director of the Center for Communication Governments at the National Law University in New Delhi, Sarjeet Singh. And last but certainly not least, delighted to welcome, to round up the speakers panel, the German member of parliament for the FDP, Alexander Kulitz. Welcome to the three of you. Very much looking forward to a vivid discussion. And Gemma, let's start with you and let's start with the Philippines. As I said, you are the head of research and strategy of the news site Rappler, a news site that made international news for all the wrong reasons in the previous couple of days, because your founder, Maria Ressa, of course, a very internationally renowned, well-known journalist, has been convicted of, well, what the court at least deemed to be a crime. Gemma, give us a quick overview of how your country, how the leadership of your country has taken on COVID-19.
So first of all, we're at 27,000 cases right now, with over 1,000 dead, and we haven't flattened the curve. It's not clear whether it's just the data, issues with the data handling, or like pending cases that haven't been, finished in terms of the testing. But basically, one of the critical things that has been really which been a lot of criticism over the government response. So we had our first case in January. And in between that January and then the actual time when government started acting, there was a big gap. And then when the government then imposed the lockdown, there were response was very incoherent and incoherent, but also many say very draconian. So you actually have a situation here where you have thousands who have been arrested, like over 10,000 from my last recollection, who have been arrested from violating quarantine measures, and there's also these many people have been like called to explain for critical posts in social media, because such an incoherent response naturally results in a lot of criticism in social media.
Thank you, Gemma, for this quick overview of the handling of the Philippine government, which has strictly enforced a quarantine that had indeed been in place for a few months now. Thank you so much for that. We will, of course, go into much more detail as the discussion unravels as to what that means for the citizens and how to move forward. But first, let's go to New Delhi. Let's go to Sarjeet Singh. Sarjeet, for those viewers who might not be too familiar with the situation as it has unfolded in the previous couple of months in India, obviously a nation that a lot of people had looked to because it's one of the most populous nations on earth. Give us the insight here.
Ali, and thanks for FNF, I think, for doing it. So in terms of India, I think currently the situation stands, we have almost 369,000 cases. Some of them have recovered. There have been around 12,000 deaths. So in terms of the number of cases, as of today, we have the fourth highest number of cases across the world. India imposed the lockdown in the last week of March, while the cases were still rising, and I think the level, at least in India, was still low. India imposed the lockdown on 24th of March without stating how long it will stay. However, in that sense, it has been the most strictest and the largest lockdown till now. The lockdown was only lifted in steps earlier this month, and there are still some restrictions there. So for the initial 1 month or more than a month, it was like very, very strict. So all the industries were closed, or the air traffic was closed, the railway services, which is the main way a lot of people in India travel across states and stuff, that was closed. Even while the external borders were closed, the government had also closed internal movement between the states or even between different districts within the same provinces. So in that sense, it has been a fairly strict stuff, lockdown. While it has slowly opened in the last couple of weeks, some of the states where the cases are rising are still following the old procedure with the very strict lockdown. And I think the problem that India is facing, whereas we have seen in a lot of other countries that after the lockdown, slowly the number of cases have started decreasing. In India, that's not the case. In India, almost every day we are touching a new peak or the new peak in terms of maximum cases. So between yesterday and today, there were almost 13,000 new cases. So I think that's the problem. In terms of just the other solutions, and I know we'll go into details on this, one of the things that India did was to come up with the contact tracing app. And for a moment in between, they made it mandatory. So they said everyone will have to download it. They asked the people in offices, one that opened, the employers had the responsibility to make sure that all the employees have it. It was in between made compulsory for railway services, domestic air services and stuff. While some of those restrictions have been loosened, it's still problematic. So that's the very broad overview, and I'm sure we'll go into more detail.
Absolutely, we will. Thank you, Sarjeet, for these numbers and the story behind these numbers, if you will, which of course we will examine in much more detail as we go further along. Very interesting thing that you touched upon that I want to pass right to Alexander Kulitz, the app, because that is the Corona app. That is a big story in Germany these days for sure. The new app that has been introduced, which is up until now voluntarily. People are being asked to download it, but no one is being forced to download it. What do you make of this, Alexander?
I believe that the tracing app in Germany is in no way comparable to the tracing app in India. Yes, it is indeed voluntarily, completely, and that was the deal that our Minister of Health had to deal with the Parliament. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to offer this app to the people. One of the main concerns of the German public, obviously, is the data law protection. And data law protection in this sense, in India, there is in Parliament at the moment some discussions about having a kind of GDPR like we do in Europe, but it's not ratified yet. And I believe in Germany, it would not be possible to even think about a tracing app or forcing people to use a tracing app the way they do it in India, considering the concerns of the people when it comes to the data law protections. Still, the app was way too expensive, and we just have the app since yesterday.
It'll be very interesting to see, of course, what the numbers at the end of the day will imply and how helpful this app is. But thank you, Alexander, for this quick overview of what the app is concerning. We will come back to you, of course, in just a little bit. But let me just point out for those joining us, you are, of course, welcome and invited to join this conversation with your questions. Please, any questions that you might have for our three speakers about the situation in the Philippines and India in particular, please do submit those questions, and we will include them as we go along. Gemma, obviously, even long before COVID, long before the coronavirus, the Philippines under President Rodrigo Duterte, who took office in 2016, it already went down, at least from the Western perspective, went down a somewhat authoritarian path. Give us a sense of if that authoritarian streak has stayed the same, or has it intensified since COVID-19 broke out?
So the measures that the president, the administration has actually imposed on the Philippines, I guess, I mean, is that like some describe them as somewhat draconian. Like for instance, when Congress enacted emergency powers, this law on granting the president emergency powers, there's a provision there that pretty much says that was inserted, and what it was penalizing what is described as fake news. We never had we don't have it before that, but basically what it does is I mean it is seen as something, a way to you go after critics, and in fact there were critics that have been called by the National Bureau of Investigation, called in or invited to questioning by the National Bureau of Investigation in this process. Now, in terms of the implementation of the quarantine, you actually have a situation where as of March, there were already 17,000 individuals who were arrested and detained due to violation of quarantine rules. And if you're looking at that from the perspective of the Philippines, where you have a prison and jail, you have no I mean, you have prison and jail facilities already so crowded because of the measures, the anti-drug measures. Then you can just imagine what that means. Now you also have right now a Congress that has already almost passed. It's just waiting for the president's signature. An anti-terrorism act, like in the middle of a pandemic, you're trying to legislate an anti-terrorism act, and this has gone, like the speed at which this was approved in the halls of Congress is very remarkable and very alarming. And one key provision in that law is this provision that basically includes in the possible criminal acts this concept of inciting to sedition, inciting to I mean, as part of the interpretation of terrorism. So it really broadens the definition of the law. So you don't have to be just actually planning something, but like it can be interpreted another way. So that those are some of the concerns right now. And then on top of that, you have an administration that has clearly been going after the media. So right now you have in the middle of the pandemic, the biggest broadcast network was forced to go off air, and all of that because Congress refused, the House of Representatives refused to act on a franchise bill that has been pending with it for quite a while now. So this is the biggest network with roughly 11,000 employees. I mean, like including its subsidiaries, if you include its subsidiaries. And then the impact of that is significant to the press, to the way the press operates. Of course, the case against us, numerous cases filed against Rappler, is also part of that whole context.
So quite troubling and concerning news and developments from what I'm hearing, as far as how the corona crisis has been exploited by the Philippine leadership and the president to further come down harsh on civil liberties. Sarjeet, Narendra Modi, also a very strong, very authoritarian leader from the outset, who's been in charge since 2014. Already, even before the corona crisis, we've seen some elements of coming down harsh on press freedom, and so on and so forth. Tell us how you evaluate the restrictions of civil liberties in the context of India and the corona crisis.
Ali, I think as you mentioned, I think since this government has come to power in 2013, we have seen a gradual erosion of civil liberties. So if we look at most of the broader press freedom or internet freedom reports, India's ranking have been decreasing because of the laws that have been passed by the government. The government again has a very nationalist and some people say even an anti-minority agenda. So that was the background in which this lockdown and corona happened. And I think the other thing we need to keep in mind is just before this lockdown happened, people had started asking questions of this government on the economy in India, because that was one of the big things on which this government came to power, saying that we will remove corruption, will increase the economy, and the GDP and everything was decreasing. So in that sense, a lot of people are saying that it's an opportune moment for the government to just now ask, like where people will stop asking all those questions and put all this on the corona crisis. In terms of just the civil liberties, I think specifically on press freedom and privacy. So one of the arguments that the India Solicitor General, who's the second senior most legal officer of the Indian government, made before the Supreme Court in one of the cases, was they wanted the press and other publishing media to not report anything on COVID that is not pre-approved by the government. So their argument was that there is a lot of misinformation out there, and that's why this platform shouldn't be publishing anything that is not pre-approved. However, thankfully, in that case, at least the Supreme Court, and again, I think the Indian Supreme Court has a history where some people look at it very progressive, some people look at it not so progressive. But in this case, at least the Supreme Court said that India has a freedom of expression and a very strong tradition of freedom of expression and press. We can't stop them. However, it also told the press to be sensitive about the kind of stories they report and to fact check and stuff. So that was one part. And I think in India, just the biggest impact of the lockdown has been on the migrants. And that's just been an unmitigated disaster. I don't think in this case, the government or anyone thought that that would happen. So in India, just for background, over 70% of Indian economy and workers work in what's called the unorganized sector. So a lot of these people are paid on a daily basis or are paid on a weekly basis. And a lot of these people are workers who have come from small towns or villages where there are not a lot of opportunities, come to bigger cities like Delhi, Bombay, etc. And I think when the lockdown happened, the government also did not anticipate it. So the lockdown was done within a span of 4 hours. The Prime Minister announced it at 8 p.m. in the evening, and 12 p.m. the strict lockdown happened. And a large number of this migrant population just lost their work overnight. So the employers weren't paying, while there were appeals made to the employers to pay, but the employers' argument was that if our businesses are shut down and stuff, we don't have resources to do it. There are stories of people walking up to 1,000 kilometers on foot to reach their homes because there were no train services and stuff. So I think that's been the biggest, I won't call it a human rights disaster probably, but that's been the biggest disaster generally. And here I think everyone agrees that this was probably not something that the government, either the central government or the state government, thought about. But this was the unintended consequences. In the past few weeks, they have started taking some measures to provide some support to all these people, but they're too little, too late. So World Bank came out with the report in mid-April, and it's been 2 months after that. And at that time, the conservative estimate of World Bank was that at least 40 million of Indian migrants would be affected. I am guessing the way we have seen the situation progress, the number which will be a lot higher. And similarly, I think there was a question in terms of support and stuff. While the government has announced a lot of measures, there's no immediate measures for either these migrant workers, for small businesses or even large businesses. There are some soaps that the government is giving in terms of that deferring payments, reducing future interest rate and stuff. So there's nothing immediate that's been done by the government.
Well, quite interesting background and information that you have provided so eloquently. Indeed, India's economy, as you pointed out, was already down even before the pandemic, and it's going to be very interesting to see if the country can afford another lockdown that puts even more people out of work in the coming weeks and months. But Alexander Kulitz, I want to bring you in here because you've listened now to the accounts of Gemma Mendoza in the Philippines and Sarabjit Singh in India, a country that you just visited in January. You were in New Delhi at a conference What do you make of those two cases?
Well, I believe if you look at it on a global scale, it doesn't sound so surprising to me, because in both cases, I believe, and that happens all over the world, sometimes the pandemic and the COVID-19 measures are more or less taken as an excuse by some governments to forward their own measures and their ideas. And as I just heard on both sides, from Gemma and also from Mr. Singh from India, it is kind of alarming, and it should be for every Democrat all over the world, because it looks like the measures are being taken to restrict the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, and also to kind of, well, at least there's a slight tendency to dismantle the idea of democracy, and I believe this should be alarming to especially Democrats all over the world. But it's not astonishing. I mean, if we look at other countries such as Russia, where we have kind of the same idea of this fake news law, where we look at Turkey, which is quite close to the European Union, where we have seen that the restriction of freedom of press has been huge. So it's kind of a tendency, an international tendency, but it's very alarming that we see it all over the world. And as we just heard, also in the Philippines and in India, mainly being the pandemic as being used as an excuse to forward these ideas. And of course, we have to deal with the situation.
And if we look at countries like Hungary and Poland, we certainly see that this even happens within the European Union as well.
Absolutely.
Gemma, what about the public trust in the info? We already have a few questions from audience members. I'm going to bring them in as we go along, but let me get back to the issue of civil liberties again, and the public trust in this government. What about the public trust in the info provided by your government? You already talked about the widespread of fake news. How do you assess that?
So the Philippines is very polarized, and you have a president still who, if you're talking about trust, you have a president who remains hugely popular. In fact, there are some recent surveys, online surveys, that say so, that he remains very popular, and that cannot be denied. But there's also a growing segment of the population, and I think like with the pandemic, that actually grew. This particular segment actually grew, which is I mean, the criticism against the administration is growing also, and during the pandemic, in fact, you had a situation where, I mean, we've been monitoring this for years, where the president has a support system, in a way, a support system, huge support system in cyberspace, in social media. He has propagandists there. He has and I mean, there are numerous groups, thousands of groups and pages on Facebook that we have monitored before, where that are basically circulating content supportive of the administration and attacking the critics. So this has been ongoing for years. But during the pandemic, you had a situation where there's so much discontent over the government response, and what that resulted, and you have people cooped up in their homes and basically doing nothing. I mean, they're working from home, and they have access to the internet, and therefore, like pretty much what happened was that people started posting about their discontent, and it came to a point. It was exacerbated by this penchant of the president for like holding press cons late night, like in the supposedly scheduled in the afternoon, but actually happens late in the evening, like post midnight sometimes. And in this press statements, people are expecting, action. People are expecting coherent response, and what they get is like basically a president ranting on and on about sometimes like unintelligible stuff. So because of that, and there was a point, in fact, that where he made this remark, like right after a group of urban poor people held a protest. Protested, and it's not yet clear whether it was an organized protest or they were there for food. because there has been no food in there was no food distributed, or there was no support distributed to those poor communities. And what happened was, late in the evening, he actually said, made this statement, and he said it's because of these left leaning groups who are inciting people into revolting against the government. So what he said is, shoot them dead if they violate quarantine rules. And that really triggered a whole, it was like like basically people just hit that limit, I guess. And you had people on Twitter, over half a million tweets overnight, all about this, like very angry people overnight. And it came to up, it was at a point where this support system that the president used to have, this propaganda network that was supporting the administration, they couldn't handle it. They some of them, some of these pages and propagandists, the pages of the propagandists, some of them, they had to take them down. They had to purposely turn off those pages because they were being reported. Like people were organizing to report them. There's this movement called We Block As One. that's
Right.
basically blocking people all over the place. And that's the context, I guess, where that's the context where you have where this administration has introduced this anti-terrorism law. So just a correction, it's not inciting to the sedition, it's inciting to terrorism. So basically, if you somehow speak, it can be interpreted as inciting. And this is coupled by these efforts to actually pin down critics and connect those critics, and sometimes using very, very false, like false claims. We actually fact check some of them and demonize critics. You see quite a lot of memes going around, and they're being used to hit and incite rage against critics.
I mean, if I understand you correctly, there is pushback. There is pushback against these draconian measures, and there is pushback amongst the public. And which brings me to some of the questions that are now coming in the chat, Sarvjit. Speaking of pushback, obviously there was quite a bit of pushback against the Citizenship Amendment Bill, even before the Corona crisis broke out. And one viewer would like to know that how do you evaluate the impact anti-corona measures have had on that amendment bill? Obviously a topic that was very intensely and emotionally debated way before COVID-19.
Thanks, Ali. And I think that's a very relevant question in this time, because I think especially since this government came to power in 2013, this was the first time, I think, where you had such citizen resistance at such large scale that was happening. And I think a lot of people were talking about it, the resistance and the protests were spreading to smaller parts of the country and stuff. What Corona basically did is, initially, I think everyone, because of advice of the government, and I think due to health reasons, all the protests were wrapped up and everyone went their home. And the conversation generally became that we will still keep protesting and stuff, and maybe once this lockdown ends, we will come back out. And that I don't think has happened. But I think for the government, this was again a great excuse to shut down these protests. One thing that was very, very surprising for a lot of people in India, even some of the people who support government on CA and stuff. So during the lockdown, when the lockdown had started and the cases were rising a lot, like in Delhi and in bigger cities, which were the hub of these protests, the government actually sent like officials and police to remove the barricades, stages that were put out by people. A lot of citizen-made graffiti that was made during the protest was painted over by people, and all this while the lockdown was in force and the corona cases were rising. So that tells you about the priority of government, at least in the initial few weeks. That was their priority. So I think that has generally been a problem. What we have seen also in the last 2 months, a lot of student protesters who were part of the CA protest have been arrested during this time. So again, I think there are at least like 5 to 10 student protesters in Delhi itself who have been arrested. Their application for bail in the courts is being opposed by the government, even though the Indian jails, as always, are overcrowded, even though the courts are generally being giving like paroles to people, bails to people. But with the student protesters, the government has really gone after like some, at least 8 or 10 of them, and have been arresting them and curbing those voices which were there against CAA.
Alexander, if we're listening to Sarjeet and Gemma and listening to their accounts about what is taking place on the ground in the Philippines and India, respectively, obviously the comparison to Germany and Europe has to fail in this particular regard. But do you see similarities as well in how the virus is being tackled and approached?
I'm not too familiar with the situation in India, but I believe there will be a lot of similarities in the fact that both countries are federal countries, more or less. So you have, and this is probably one of the issues that we had to cope with in Germany, especially that the states themselves are more or less in charge of the pandemic, and we had a hard time getting the states together and have a common...
I'm not sure. There you go.
Oh, was that offline?
You were in and out. You were in and out, but go ahead.
Sorry. So I believe there might be some similarities, but overall, I believe it's a question of the relationship between governments and people and citizens, and this might differ very, very much when it comes to the Philippines and to India. So the restriction of civil rights, which obviously we also had in Germany, and there has been protests, but I think the tendencies are quite different. So whereas in Germany, the restriction of the civil rights was more of, I would say, a change of narrative, whereas up to now, the government very much had to every time the civil right was restricted, the government had to very much explain why this was. And we have a change of narrative at the moment in Germany. So it seems like more or less the government is expecting citizens to be thankful or grateful for having a relief on restrictions. That's kind of a dangerous change of narrative, but it's of course nothing compared to what is happening and what I just heard from Gemma and from Savjit from India, where the government is more or less the strong power that grants or disgrants civil rights to the citizens. So there's no comparison on that, but I still would love to see, or I still kind of like to draw at least the similarity in the change of narrative that has happened due to the COVID pandemic. Yes.
Gemma, Yasmin Lorak wants to know what the current role of civil society is right now in the Philippines. I know you touched upon this briefly, but perhaps you can quickly elaborate on that as well. The question is if the civil society can still act as a watchdog against the Duterte government's tendencies.
So what happened was that yes, you have civil society pushing back. There are a lot of groups that are pushing back, but they are also demonized. So you have them. There's a term that people use for people who are protesting against or like criticizing government. They call them dilawans, and what that means is that they're aligned with the previous administration, and therefore to be maligned. So it's the attacks against the press is also like was also the same approach to the press was also applied to civil society and other groups, other critics. So it's something, it's systematic. If you speak up, what happens is that you'll have a flood of, you could be mobbed, you can on social media, you could be harassed on social media, you could be they could create all of these false claims against you on social media.
There are repercussions clearly for speaking out.
There are repercussions for speaking up.
Yeah. Sarjeet, how about in India and the role of civil society there? Can they provide a counter narrative, counterbalance to the authoritarian tendencies of a strong government?
I don't think there's an easy answer in India to that question. I think we have a very robust civil society, and the civil society has been pushing back against the government tendencies over the past few years. With this government specifically, I think we have also seen the government pushing back and clamping down on the civil society, especially because we have acts like the Foreign Contribution Regulation Acts and stuff. So that's the case. Otherwise, but generally in terms of pushback, I think there is still enough pushback. While I think the trust in media and generally the freedom of media itself has been compromised in the past few years, there are still online portals, there are still portals which give all sides of the story, which have a counter narrative to the government. So that's I think the bigger problem in India is just the disinformation that India has seen in the last few years, and especially around healthcare. So, and the biggest disinformation is from non-state actors, mostly aligned to respective political parties. So it's not just like that the ruling party is doing disinformation, all of them are doing, but just the scale at which the ruling party and its members are spreading disinformation is massive. I think people have documented it. And the biggest thing in India is just that most of this disinformation also goes through WhatsApp. So India has over 400 million WhatsApp users. A lot of these people are first-time users in small towns and cities. For them, outside of their immediate communities, they do not have any external engagement. So I think whatever they receive on these WhatsApp groups and stuff, they always take is that truth. And in the past, it has been harmful in terms of killings and lynchings. And even currently, I think the biggest problem that people are facing is that the disinformation around the cure and what the government is doing and stuff. So there's a massive, massive disinformation that's there.
Clearly, Alexander Kulitz, you are, amongst other things, very well-known business economy expert. And as both Sarvjit and Gemma have touched upon in this discussion, both countries obviously were hit very hard economically by this virus. Both countries were already struggling way before Corona even came into place. Compare that to the discussion that we're having in the EU as well, where a lot of countries are struggling financially and are looking towards the EU now to lift them up and provide much needed assistance in times like these.
Well, definitely. I mean, we are just at the beginning of probably world economic crisis. And we're seeing since April the first figures also in Germany and within Europe. And there is a big difference. I mean, Europe is probably one of the most wealthiest continents on the globe. So if we look at Germany, there's a lot of demand at the moment from the mid-sized small entrepreneurs, but also from the Mittelstand companies, the family-owned companies, and the big ones, that they want the state to step in. And for once, it's yes, because in many measures, it was the state who killed the market. So it's not that the market wasn't working adequately. It was the state who decided, okay, in this case, I don't know, restaurants, hotels, for example, fairs, they're not allowed anymore. So at this point, the people stepped in, and entrepreneurs, they are asking for help. Now on the European level, I think we failed at the beginning because this pandemic was not managed on a European level from the beginning. So until Europe stepped in, and this is what we're slowly experiencing just now. So it's not that we have had Europe since February stepping in and assisting. This is just happening now. And of course, the demands are very high, but on the long run, even though we are very rich countries, it's going to be very difficult in any kind to reimburse what we are doing at the moment with all these measures on the national level, on the European level. And we will see what happens. One of the big discussions at the moment is the Corona bonds. So not sure on how this will evolve, but we will not be able to save everything, that's for sure.
And certainly, as you pointed out, the fallout, economic fallout of this crisis on a global scale cannot even be foreseen at this particular point, might just be the tip of the iceberg, which also, Sarvjit, brings up a question from Julius Leiter in the Q&A forum. He's asking, how about the support for the many small one-man or family businesses in India that were affected by the lockdown?
So Ali, as I briefly mentioned earlier, there is a lack of any immediate support by the government. So the government has announced a very big economic package. And I think in the long term, that may help some industries in terms of taxes, other payments that they have to do. The government is reimbursing them. There's a push by the government on what they are calling Make in India, that a lot of things that the government was initially exporting or importing and India was importing, they are saying that they'll provide benefits to local industries to make a lot of those things internally. And going forward, maybe that will help some of these industries, but the immediate support to especially as the question said, to smaller businessmen or even to bigger industries is very immense. And a lot of industries, like there have been reports that they won't survive. For an example, just in terms of small restaurants and stuff, just in the capital city of Delhi, there's a report that says once we completely come out of lockdown and in a few months, we may actually see 40 to 50% of restaurants in a big city like Delhi shut down. So I think between that and the migrant crisis, I think the economic fallout will be immense, and it will probably take a while before India comes back to like a reasonable GDP, a reasonable growth.
And I suppose that holds true for many, many countries, certainly those here in the chat. Philippines, of course, also a country that was hit, that had where the pandemic had a devastating effect on the economy. Gemma, Alexander spoke about the Corona app, the tracing app that is now being introduced and implemented in Germany. And Frank Hoffmann in the chat function is asking if you could touch upon the issue of contact tracing, how this is done in your country, in this particular case, in the Philippines. And of course, what are the dangers associated with contact tracing?
So first of all, we really failed at contact tracing from the get-go. There was very little, I think government just decided to start like recruiting additional people just for contact tracing after after the lockdown, and that was met with quite a lot of criticism. There were a number of apps. There's no single app that is being circulated, but there's a particular app that we reported about, which is really a concern. Because in our story, IT experts described it as like a borderline spyware because of the amount of things that it is, the amount of access levels that it is requiring. So that's something that is a big concern for us, particularly because of the political climate here. And it is not yet imposed. I'm not required to use the app right now, but also that's because I'm not moving around. I'm mostly staying at home, but that's something of a concern that is being discussed at the moment.
Sarvjit, how about in India? Do you have the equivalence of the German Corona app?
We do, Ali. So we have the app that's called the Arogya Setu app. It was launched, I think, a little after the lockdown started, and for the initial time, I think the government and everyone was promoting it, saying that it was the first app in the world, or the app in the world to get fastest to 100 million downloads. So a lot of people did download it voluntarily. But I think the problem became that India in between made it mandatory. So it made it mandatory for local travel if you had to step out and stuff. And that becomes even more problematic because, as I think initially at the start of the discussion, Mr. Kulit said, Germany has or Europe has the GDPR. India, unlike Europe and some of the other countries, does not have a data protection law currently. There's a law that's currently being debated in the parliament, but currently we do not have. We have a couple of provisions which do not really do anything. And even those provisions aren't really applicable against the government. So if this app is misused or if the data is leaked, there's not much of a recourse for any citizen here. And the problem was that even the way the app was designed, so the app, while pushed out by the government, there have been reports were designed by industry volunteers, so private people. And initially the story was, that they are doing it as a social good and stuff. But over the few weeks, we have also seen that the government integrating telemedicine services or other services with these apps, which these volunteers or the companies they came from have a direct economic stake in. So I think one the question of just the data protection, and secondly, like where the government is even coming from. So the other thing that the government said that in future this app may be used as a base for a national health data stack, which is problematic again with no data protection law. India already has the largest biometric system where over 1 billion people are already registered to it. So I think all these systems, when combined together, there's a very high possibility that if someone wants to misuse it for surveillance or other stuff, they can. And there's not much recourse for a citizen in this case.
Alexander Kulitz, about the tracing app, whether it's in India, Germany, or anywhere else, obviously data protection, as you pointed out, is key here, is essential in order to make sure that information is not being misused. This is going to be a discussion that will only become more important going forward, no?
Most definitely. I mean, the question is not only with the tracing app, all these technologies that we start using now due to the pandemic, also this chat, this Zoom call, those are all technologies that we will certainly continue using once the pandemic is over. And the question will be, especially to these apps and to the databases that are being created with these apps, what are they going to be used for after the pandemic? I mean, even as a liberal, there is nothing against the fight of infections through an app, but the question really has to be discussed, especially afterwards. Is this only to confront the pandemic, the data, or do we use the data for different stuff too? If we look at China, and they were very efficient at the beginning, still are very efficient when it comes on tracing the infection. Of course, the app, which is WeChat, is used for many, many other things. And of course, it's very easy for Chinese government to kind of use the data sources for many other things. This was one of the main concerns in Germany. This is why the German app has a completely different technology. So we do not have a centralized database, which makes it much more complicated and much harder to track down the infections. But on the other hand, it gives people the security that the data cannot be misused for other things. I'm sure the discussion will follow after the pandemic, but not only discussion on the tracing app and the databases, on all kinds of other issues that might arose from this crisis. Also, the use of technological means, just like Zoom, like GoToMeeting, like Cisco, different ones. Yeah.
This is absolutely. This is undoubtedly discussion that will be with us for a long time to come. Now, as far as this discussion is concerned, we are in the final stretch. We have 10 minutes left until we have to conclude this talk. That is why, Gemma, you've already provided eloquently a situation and an overview of the status quo. Let's look into the future and pick up on a question of Janjira in the Q&A forum. The question is, with regard to the civic pushback, would you think this will persist even after the pandemic is solved, is tackled, however you want to call it? Will it affect the government's chance to stay in power? So do look into the future. Let's look at a post-COVID world. You've already talked about the measures that have been introduced by the Philippine government to tackle this crisis and restrict civil liberties in the process. Do you think these implementations will also hold true and be valid once the pandemic is under control?
So if I am to be optimistic, it might, but at the same time, as I mentioned, the state is also, this is not just civil society pushing back, but state is also pushing back hard. You have new measures, the anti-terrorism bill, civil society, people who are, activists are being branded as terrorists. And some have been, there are quite a number who have been killed during the lockdown. Assassinated. So so you have a situation where it's really very difficult right now to predict how it goes. It you have a uh growing base of criticism. You have growing base of critics really exposing what's going on, really speaking out. But at the same time, you have all of these measures that are being put in place to push back, to control that, to address that criticism, and that could go either way at the moment. It's very difficult right now to see. And you have to consider that this government has taken very extreme measures, and those extreme measures could result in certain repercussions, not just within the Philippines, but in the international realm. And therefore, this government will likely try to also protect itself beyond beyond the current limitations of its present its supposed limitations of its term. So those are things to consider. We're already seeing that this crisis is being used to promote certain personalities who might be who are widely believed to be being groomed as successors to the president. So those are things to keep watching.
Do you think this crisis has strengthened, has consolidated the role of Duterte?
Um, it has exposed chinks in the armor, I would say. So you can see, like, it's I mean, the thing that's different about this pandemic is that the threat is something that could affect anyone. So I think that's the reason why you have that level of criticism, really, like hitting that tipping point, because I almost tipping point, that I would say, because it could affect you. Like, it's the enemy is hidden, and you're not seeing action. If you're not seeing, like, and like there are a lot of small businesses here also who are affected, who went out of business, who have no way to, so people who have no way to support their families, looking for avenues out there, and it's gonna get worse. So that's there, that ground is there. But at the same time, that makes you think about why these measures, the draconian measures, are being put in place. And the way things are, he holds the powers. He basically controls the entire government. There's very little that you can. There's very little room. So for instance, you have Congress. Pretty much. He pretty much controls Congress, both the House and we expected more from the Senate,
So
and but this law actually started from the Senate. It was the Senate who first approved this. So this bill that is now pending and waiting for his signature, and then you also have a Supreme Court that has pretty much agreed with him for the most part. So you don't really have, there's really very little avenues for pushing back right now. And if you ask me, the pushback is really just happening there in cyberspace and in the streets.
Right. So since we only have 5 minutes left, as I understand, short term, certainly not much reason to be overly optimistic, but there are cracks that we are seeing. Gemma, thank you so much for your take and assessment of the situation in the Philippines. Sarvjit, also, let's look into the crystal ball and into the future. How do you think this will play out in India, and the role of Modi in particular?
I think, as Gemma said, I think even in India is too early, I think, to make that assessment, especially because this government still has 4 more years in power before the next election. And I think a lot of things will generally change. So especially, I think even the discussion around the economy and Corona has changed in the past week or so, especially with the regional crisis between India and China that has been happening in the past few days. So I think it'll also depend on the kind of conversation that are happening. And the biggest problem in India in this case is the lack of a strong opposition. So in the past few years, we have seen basically at the central level or the national level, there is no opposition. There is one party which was supposed to be a pan-India party, again, that hardly has any representation in the lower house of the parliament. There are a lot of regional state parties. But again, I think especially around Corona, it's not like they have been a lot more efficient than, let's say, the central government. So the problem with dealing with Corona has, I think, been there across parties, across whatever parties are there. And I think the prime minister still remains a highly popular figure. Even if his party may be criticized, his government may be criticized, he himself remains a highly popular figure. So I think going forward, especially in the short term, what happens with the dispute or the crisis with China, and in the long term, I think how the government tries to recover the economy, that'll play a big role on whether the government returns or not.
And the conflict, the Indian conflict, Indian-Chinese conflict, indeed, if we were to take that up, would take up another hour, a very interesting and very timely issue right there. Sarvjit, thank you so much for your assessment and take. Alexander Kulis, generally speaking, not just with regards to the Philippines and India, but also, of course, including the two. If you look at the previous few months and since the outbreak of the pandemic, do you think this pandemic has benefited governments that tend to have authoritarian, are of authoritarian nature, or do you think it's the opposite? What's your take?
Well, in the short term, I believe that autocratic regimes will benefit. It's not a secret that in times of crisis, people are calling for strong leadership. And we can see this all over the world. The question is on the long run, because will this be a sustainable kind of movement? Will people still ask for strong leadership once they start to not see the crisis being as emerging, as important anymore? I don't have an answer on that. I believe it very much depends on the country. It very much depends on the governments, how they actually use their power in times of Corona. Do people have the feeling that they use the power to really confront the virus and the pandemic, or is the feeling rather that they misuse the power by taking Corona as an excuse to implement their power, to strengthen their autocracies? It's it's difficult to say in general. I think you really have to look at every country especially.
Indeed, the jury is still out on what form of government and what form of leadership might and will prevail in the aftermath in the post-pandemic, post-COVID world. This wraps up the fifth and last edition of the Web Talk series, Pandemic Panic Politics, Democracy in Times of Crisis. Huge thanks to Gemma Mendoza from the Philippines, Sarvjit Singh from India, and of course, Alexander Kulis, member of the German Parliament, for bringing it all together. We've sort of took a tour all around the world with this Web Talk series, starting in Europe, all the way to Africa, the Middle East, and now in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Certainly many interesting parallels, but also differences that have emerged throughout this process. Thanks to everyone who joined, not just this debate, but all the previous ones as well. And again, thanks to Manila, to Gemma, big thanks to New Delhi, to Sarvjit, and of course in Berlin, Alexander Kulis. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for watching, everyone.
Thank you so much.